Yay. I don't like when it doesn't work. I hear people coming in. There we go.
I recognize the person coming on.
Hello, hello.
Hey, Chris.
Hi, Lisa.
Got it going in.
Okay, I'm here. Okay. Yes, as for those of you who are not used to, all of you know, I kind of give us a few minutes leeway for people to sign in. So we'll just chat until people get here. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Tim Slavinsky. We're talking a lot about Portugal because my husband and I are moving to Portugal soon. So we're leaving Savannah. I'll be leaving my job at Israel to start life in a new culture, a new country. It's exciting. It's I can't wait to get there, to be honest with you. You know, we started selling off some of our stuff in our house. Our house is sold already. We've already sold the house, and we're having, you know, people come in and people have bought some things, and we're packing up the paintings. I mean, you really have to wrap your artwork really, really carefully to make sure it gets across the ocean without being damaged. But you know, it's all exciting. It's a very exciting move for us. And as I was saying to Kara, there's a Jewish Renaissance going on in Portugal right now. So that's exciting to be a part of that too. Portugal has allowed people that were expelled during the Inquisition to come back, and they will automatically be given Portuguese citizenship. So I'm hearing feedback. I don't know why from somebody. Anyway, so that's kind of where I am right now. Welcome, everybody. Welcome.
I knew you were old, but you were around during the Inquisition?
No, well, yeah, it was kind of a bad time, you know. I'm actually reading a book that was recommended to me by, okay, somebody's giving, I don't know who's got the feedback coming where I'm hearing myself twice. Anyway, I'm reading a book called The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, which is a novel written by a writer who lives in Portugal. And I'm hoping to meet him when I get there. It takes place during the Inquisition years of the conversos in Lisbon, in Portugal. It's a very dense, very heavy book. It's a novel, but it's historically researched. I would recommend it, but be prepared for a lot of really horrible details about the Inquisition. So I would just put that caveat out there. It's a good book. It's a dense, heavy book, but it does have some pretty grotesque, gory details. If you don't like that kind of stuff, even though it's historically accurate, I wouldn't suggest reading it. So anyway, I'm gonna give everybody a couple more minutes, then we'll get started on our history of Reform Judaism. So I know there were other people who signed up, but I don't know if they're gonna make it tonight or not. Let's see.
I had so much paper out there. So subtle. I'm just gonna school. I think there's 4 paper tonight.
Jeff, you have some.
I had my notebook.
Lottie and Jeff, I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me. I can hear you.
Yes,
No, we
you
finally-
did come in.
Okay.
Can't come in by computer, we came in by telephone.
Okay.
We
Sometimes, you know.
didn't give up, Tim. You noticed that.
That's okay. That's okay. All right, I'm gonna wait one more minute, then I'll get started. Because I have to make sure, I mean, I've got these classes scheduled to be about an hour, maybe slightly over, depending on questions and whatever. Tonight, though, the rabbi has something at 8 o'clock, and I cannot infringe on the rabbi's time. So I don't want the rabbi mad at me. So I'll make sure that we're finished in time.
Like some wine, Jeff.
Oh, somebody's pouring wine. That sounds delicious.
Yes, Tim, some white wine.
Oh, of course, you're in Florida, so it's very warm
Some
there.
port. We'll have some port.
From Port. Oh, well, that's Porto, Portugal. It's what it's known for is port. So, welcome, Amy. I can't see you, but you're there. Tori, can't see you, but you're there.
I'll show my face a little.
There you go, Amy.
I
Hello,
do.
hello.
Hello.
All right, I'm going to mute everybody and get started. So anyway, if you have, as always, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. I don't take offense at that. So feel free to just say, I have something I'd like to ask. I don't promise that I'll have the answers because I just, I know a lot, but I don't know everything. But feel free to stop if you do have a question and ask. I'm perfectly okay with that. If you need to get up and do something, use the restroom, get a drink of water, or if something stronger, if that's your case, let the dog out, let the dog in, the cat out, the cat in, whatever. Feel free to do that. You're at home and things happen. You're at home, or if your boss is calling and offering you a $25,000 raise, make sure you take the call. You wouldn't want to say no to that. Anyway, so let's get started. So tonight's topic, we're going to talk about the history of Reform Judaism, which of course is what Mikveh Israel is a part of the Union of Reform Judaism. It is a Reform synagogue. So where did this whole notion of Reform Judaism start? Because prior to the beginnings of Reform Judaism, there was pretty much just kind of Judaism. And it's not that every single part of the world practiced it exactly the same way. For those of you who've taken classes from me in the past, there's a word called minhag, M-I-N-H-A-G. Minhag means custom. And in every community, they would have their minhag of how they might conduct services and celebrate holidays, etc. So while it was similar, every community would have its own minhag of how they would celebrate. But then comes along this idea of reform. And reform came out of this whole period of history that we call today the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a time when people began to trust more in science. They began to trust more in the idea that there was a plausible explanation for things that happened in the world. And they wanted to know those explanations and understand them. The power of religion, particularly Christianity and particularly the Roman Catholic Church, began to diminish. People began to think more of science, logic, and reason for explanations rather than looking to religion for explanations. So there was this major shift in the way people were thinking, and we now call that period the Enlightenment. And out of the Enlightenment, when this would be the early to mid 1800s, so we're not going back that far, but in the early to mid 1800s, people began to rethink the whole business of religion and how it was practiced, religion and what it meant in their lives. And this is where Reform Judaism would come from. It may be interesting for people to know that the idea for a reform movement came from not the rabbis, came from the people. It was a movement that was started by the people. There were people in this newly enlightened society who said, we want a religion and we want a way to worship that is, for lack of a better word, more modern, more up to date. And in some ways, the people who began Reform Judaism said, we want a service that we understand. Most of us don't know Hebrew well, and some of us don't know Hebrew at all. We would like a service that when we come to synagogue, we are going to be able to understand the majority of it. We want a rabbi to give us a sermon in a language we understand, which would be the language we speak. And this was primarily in Germany, was where this started, interestingly enough. So they said, have the rabbi deliver a sermon in German? Can't we say some of the prayers in German? So they wanted a service that was more meaningful to them rather than coming to synagogue, sitting there, not understanding the majority of the Hebrew that was being chanted or spoken. And so this is where the whole Reform movement came from. It came from people who wanted a more meaningful worship service. And I'm just going to be very honest here. They also wanted a worship service, a synagogue service that would, for lack of a better word, copy their Christian neighbors, their Gentile neighbors. They saw their Christian neighbors and coworkers and colleagues who would go to church on Sundays for a service, and within an hour or so, they were finished, they left, and they went about their day. Up to this point, Jewish services were 3.5 to 4 hours long, and that wasn't appealing to the people. So a service that would be meaningful, a service that wasn't going to be quite so lengthy, a service that when they walked out of it, there was going to be something that they could mull over in their heads from the rabbi's sermon, prayers that made sense to them because they were praying in the language that they understood. So it really was a movement that started with the people. Now, the first Reform congregation, who is credited with having the very, very first Reform congregation, there was a Jewish community in the city of Seesen, 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 Germany, and it is credited with being the very first Reform congregation in the world. And this is 1810. What did they do in Seesen, Germany? Horror of horrors, they had a choir. There had never been choirs used in Jewish worship services. And they brought in music, instrumental music, which was a brand new concept in the synagogue. And the rabbi actually did deliver a sermon or a Devar Torah on the Torah portion in German. So this was considered to be a very, very revolutionary thing in this community. And so it is credited to this day with having the very first Reform congregation that we know of. So this is how Reform Judaism started. It started relatively small with people who just said, we need something that makes more sense to us. We want a Judaism that we can relate to, that when we come to synagogue, we walk out and we have something to relate to. And this is where Rabbi Abraham Geiger comes in. Rabbi Abraham Geiger was a German rabbi, respected rabbi, who listened to this movement among the people, who listened to what the people were saying. And so he is credited with being really the founder of what today we call Reform Judaism, its first real rabbinic leader. And we're talking mid-1800s here, when Rabbi Geiger said, if we want to hold on to the people, if we want with this new period of enlightenment to be something that people will cling to as a religious, spiritual base, we have to listen to what the people want. So Geiger said, here are some things that we are going to do. Geiger said, we are going to pray in the language of the people. Now, he wasn't dismissing Hebrew entirely, but he said we have to have prayers where the people can pray together, pray in community in a language they understand. He also made a huge change in the synagogue by saying, we are going to allow men and women to sit together. You know that in Orthodox congregations, that does not happen. But he said, there's no reason why men and women cannot sit together and why families cannot come to synagogue and sit together. To us, that may not sound like a real revolutionary move, but at the time, it really, really was. He said, we are going to bring people to sing a part of the service. So we will institute choral singing. we will institute choirs into Reform services, where we will make music a part of worship and a key part of worship. And finally, he was also the first rabbi, well, actually two more things. He also said, we don't have to have 2-day holidays. Now, we know even today that Orthodox Jews, and in many cases conservative Jews, will oftentimes celebrate 2 days of a holiday, whereas in Reform Judaism, we have 1 day. Rabbi Geiger said, we have modern calendars now. We have modern ways of telling time and keeping time. The 2-day idea of the holiday is a very ancient idea. We don't need it anymore. We can celebrate the holidays for 1 day. And the last thing that he did was he said, there's no reason why, like our Christian brothers and sisters, we can't put an organ in the synagogue. That we can bring an organ in to accompany the choral singing, to accompany the people singing. So why not bring an organ into the synagogue, much like our Christian brothers and sisters have in their churches? So he really was instituting a number of revolutionary things into the service, and Reform synagogues, or that followed what Geiger said. Technically, it was not a Reform movement yet, but more and more synagogues throughout Germany at first, and then into other parts of primarily Western Europe, began to institute maybe not all of the changes that Geiger was advocating, but at least some of the changes that Geiger was advocating, because the people were responding in a positive way to the idea of a service. And he did shorten the service also, I should mention that. The service did go from your 3.5 hour service to a service that could be finished in an hour to an hour and a half, which was much more appealing. It still was Shabbat. It still was Friday evening, welcoming the Sabbath. It still was a Saturday morning service, but it was going to be something that was more in line with Christian services in terms of duration and length. So while today we look at these changes, maybe don't think of them as being quite that revolutionary, at the time they were very revolutionary. Not every single rabbi went along with him. There were those who were very much against what Geiger was doing. There were synagogue communities that did not institute these changes. So this is why we would have the beginning now of Jewish movements. We have this modern progressive movement that was moving toward what the people wanted, but those who wanted to stick with a more orthodox traditional way of worship in the synagogue, there were certainly going to be congregations for them as well. So we're talking, again, mid-1800s. Now, from the mid-1800s to the 1840s, 1850s, we would have a great deal of immigration from Europe to the United States. And the Jews who were coming from Europe and from Germany and other countries, United States, brought Reform Judaism with them to the United States. And it really is in the United States of America where Reform Judaism will grow, will blossom, and it will flourish in the United States of America. So when these Jewish immigrants come to the United States and begin to establish communities in different cities and different locations, they are bringing with them this more modern way of Jewish worship to the United States. Now, there's argument about this, but I'm just going to tell you what the history books say. Our neighbors to the north, Charleston, South Carolina, are actually given credit for starting the first Reform society in the United States of America. So if you're wondering, where do we have the birth of a true Reform movement in the US, it's in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1824, a group that called themselves the Reform Society of Israelites began a congregation. So the Reform Society of Israelites, 1824 in Charleston, and this is Congregation Beth Elohim, which would be established and officially became a Reform congregation in 1841. Now, if you're looking at Mikveh Israel, because we have our 1733 date, remember that Mikveh Israel started as a traditional Sephardic congregation. It was Orthodox. Mikveh Israel would switch to being a Reformed congregation about 20 years later, in the 1860s, when it would officially, in early 1870s, when it would officially adopt the Reform movement's way of worship and mixed seating, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we are the third oldest congregation, and we pride ourselves on that. But it was Congregation Beth Elohim that actually got to the Reform movement tag a little bit before we did. So now we have this growing movement in the United States. It didn't abandon Europe. I mean, Reform would continue in Europe as well, but it's here in the United States where it really began to take root. The first leader in the United States of the Reform movement was Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise was the first rabbi to lead what would become the Reform movement, what we call the United URJ, United Reform Congregations today. He was actually the leader, the rabbi of congregation B'nai Jeshurun in Cincinnati, Ohio, because Cincinnati would become the seat of Reform Judaism, which people find interesting. Why did it go into the Midwest? Why not on the East Coast? Why not someplace like New York or Philadelphia or Boston or one of the major cities on the East Coast? Why Cincinnati? Because a number of the people who were coming over from Europe who were of the Reform movement were actually moving into the interior of the country where there were jobs that were more available. We know that so much of retail and stores and department stores and drugstores and mercantile stores were begun by Jews who were immigrants from Europe. And these people were needed in the middle of the country. So to Rabbi Wise, it made sense to put the seat of this new movement somewhere in the middle of the country. Cincinnati was a growing community that had a fairly sizable Jewish population. And so that's where we would have the beginnings of this this Reform movement. Okay, so we have Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. He's the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Jeshurun. He is going to lead this Reform movement. And he would actually, it was under Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise that the first official Reform prayer book, or Siddur, would actually come out, an actual Reform prayer book. And it was known as Minhag America. Minhag, remember, means custom. So they just called the first Reform prayer book Minhag America, the custom of America. In other words, this is how American Jews, American Reform Jews, was going to be practiced in the New World, so to speak. So Minhag America would be published in 1857, and that is thought of as the very first Reform prayer book in the United States. It was written to be user-friendly. What does that mean? There were a lot of prayers in English, so the people could read the prayers, understand the prayers. Again, it did not abandon Hebrew entirely, but a number of the prayers were now translated into English. It was meant to be a participatory prayer book where it wasn't all just on the rabbi anymore. The rabbi could lead the prayer with the congregation responding, which was a fairly new concept in Judaism. So it was meant to be this participatory prayer book where the people could respond in English, in their own language, and actually understand what they were saying, what they were praying, the words. And again, this was a very, very revolutionary idea to have a prayer book that had not only Hebrew in it, but a prayer book that had a good deal of English in it as well. Certain prayers would remain in Hebrew, the Shema, of course, but would be followed by an English translation. So people could pray the Shema in Hebrew, but then they would immediately follow it with the Shema in English. So I said it in Hebrew, but now I can see what I actually said when I recited the Hebrew. Prayers like the Baruch Hu, the call to worship, could be recited in Hebrew, but immediately followed by an English translation. So that once you said the Hebrew, you now understood as well what the words that you just recited were saying. And if you think about it from someone who is sitting in the seats, who is not a rabbi, whose Hebrew is perhaps minimal at best, because the vast majority of the people were not well versed in Hebrew, to be able to sit there and participate, to be a part of the service, and to understand the actual words of prayer, the actual words of worship, really would make people much more inclined to come back to synagogue, because they were able to leave a service having gained something, gained some sense of spirituality, and having a rabbi who would deliver a sermon to them in English so they could get some sense of a lesson or teaching, ethics, principles that the rabbi was trying to impart from the Torah portion. So this was a major step forward in allowing Judaism in the United States of America to continue to grow. But before I go any further, anybody have a question at this point or anything they want to ask or add or whatever? Or I'll just keep on going. Okay, very good, but feel free if you have one, don't feel like you have to sit silently. Okay, moving on. 1873 is where we are now. And we have the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. If you have your outline in front of you, that's the UAHC. This is the first formalized grouping of synagogues and congregations in the United States, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Notice that the word Jewish is not in the title. Union of American Hebrew Congregations. That was done on purpose. They did not want the word Jewish in the title at that time. Of course, the people who were here were very well aware of anti-Semitism, and they felt that if they left the word Jewish out of the title, it may lessen any kind of anti-Semitic backlash. So hence, the word Jewish did not appear in it. So in 1873, this became the umbrella organization. At the beginning, it was for all synagogues of any type, not just Reform synagogues. So there were some Orthodox synagogues that joined as well, so that they would have some sort of sense of organization as Judaism was growing in the United States of America. So it was not limited initially to just Reform congregations. Any Jewish congregation that was Orthodox, that was Reform, or somewhere between the two. And there were many congregations who were not necessarily declared congregations at this point. So it was for all Jewish synagogues, all Jewish congregations could join the UAHC when it was started in 1873. The one thing that they realized very quickly, this new organization, this UAHC organization, is we need a place to train clergy. We need a place to train rabbis to then go out and serve the congregations, to be spiritual leaders for the Jewish people. And so 2 years after the UAHC, Hebrew Union College is founded. So in 1875, we have the start of Hebrew Union College. And again, this is in Cincinnati. It's in Cincinnati, Ohio. So in 1875, it's the very first permanent Jewish institution of higher learning in the United States. And its primary purpose, its primary goal initially, today it has broadened what you can study at Hebrew Union College, but its first mission was to have a formalized program of training for rabbis. Up to this point, rabbis were sort of trained at the knee of other rabbis. And I'm going to be very honest with you. If you were fairly Jewishly literate, you could call yourself a rabbi and nobody was going to argue with you. You could say, well, I know Judaism pretty well, and I'm pretty okay with Hebrew, and I think I've got good leadership skills, so I'm going to call myself a rabbi. And if a congregation was willing to invest in you, you were now a rabbi. Well, that was going to change. because now there is an institution of higher learning, a college that is going to have a formalized program of study, clearly in theology, in Torah, and in Hebrew, and in the ancient texts, the Talmud, et cetera, So rabbis will now have a formalized program of study so that when they graduate from Hebrew Union College, there are expectations. So a congregation hiring a rabbi can have certain expectations of the person that they are hiring. Now, of course, this time it was only men who could study for the rabbinate. Reform Judaism will open up the rabbinate to women, for female rabbis, but at this point, that had not happened yet. The other thing that the UAHC decided to do in the 1870s was to take a census. How many Jews are there in the United States? Nobody had really set about to try to count, with the immigration dating back, to the early 1700s and then waves of immigration in the 1800s. Nobody had really undertaken a real count of how many Jews were actually living in the United States of America. So the UAHC said, we really should try to get a census, like how many of us are there living in this country? So they set about, and I don't know what their methodology was. I don't really know if they went door to door to figure this out, or whether they relied on individual rabbis and congregations to report, attendance at services, or who was considered to be a congregant in a particular congregation. But they came up with a number, and the number they came up with was 250,000. 250,000 Jews living in the United States of America by the mid 1870s. So 250,000 people, which is a relatively small number of people, but it was continuing to grow. And they knew that it would continue to grow as Jewish immigration would continue from Europe. But that's what we know of as the first official Jewish census taken by the UAHC to get a count of how many Jews were living in the United States. At this point, in the late 1870s, early 1880s, reform is the primary expression of Judaism in the United States. Were there congregations that were strictly Orthodox? Yes, of course, there were. But the majority of Jews in America were choosing to associate themselves and align themselves with the reform movement, the more modern, the more progressive expression of Judaism. Membership in the more traditional congregations, what we would think of as Orthodox congregations, was beginning to fall behind. So things are moving forward. Reform Judaism is growing. We now have an institution of higher learning to train rabbis so we can have expectations of our spiritual leaders. And things seem to be going really, really well. And then some would say that there was a sort of tragedy that struck Reform Judaism in 1883. What could be the horrible tragedy of 1883 for Reform Judaism? Well, in 1883, the Hebrew Union College was going to ordain its first official class of rabbis, those who had gone through an intense period of study and training. And so they were very, very proud of this. Let's make this into a really, really big deal. Let's celebrate that we have official training for rabbis in the United States. Let's invite dignitaries. Let's invite, even including non-Jews, because this is a big deal. Let's show that we are American and we are here and we have taken a stand for our religious values and our religious institutions. And so they did. And they had what would come to be known in the history of Judaism and in the history of Reform Judaism as the Treif banquet. The treif, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, when you eat treif, you are eating non-kosher food. You may be eating some lovely crab legs or shrimp, or you may be having, some meat and cheese together, dairy meat, which of course is not kosher. So if you look at the menu for the treif banquet, it started with shrimp cocktail, was the first item on the menu. Later on, to the various courses that were being served were some lovely seared scallops. Later on down in the menu, right after a lovely steak would be followed by an ice cream course without the allotted time between meat and dairy. So here is this banquet that was meant to be a very, very classy affair, and it was, and dignitaries, Jewish and non-Jewish dignitaries, being invited to this first major graduating class of rabbis, and here we have treif being served. Needless to say, many of the Jewish dignitaries who were invited were horrified, and left, got up and left, and said, this is just, we're trying to modernize Judaism. And yes, we want a modern expression of Judaism, and we're all about that. But there are just some lines we can't cross. We cannot cross at serving at a Jewish institution, no less, treif. We just can't have it. And so there were a number of Jewish dignitaries, including rabbis, who said, this whole reform thing is just going a bit too far, and we can't do it. We can't do it. And this is where conservative Judaism would begin. This is where we would have the beginning. It's not all from this banquet, but this banquet made some rabbis and Jewish leaders say, we want change, but we have to have a limit on change. And this is where these rabbis would form a new school, and it would be called JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, to train what would become conservative rabbis that would be the first rabbis of the conservative movement, a movement that tried to kind of bridge the gap between the ultra-reform changes and the Orthodox. So it's interesting that would be where now we would have another new strain of Judaism, because some just couldn't say, I can't go to treif, I can't eat meat and dairy, I can't have the shellfish. So, and now the UAHC, which welcomed all Jewish congregations, would now become specifically just for Reform congregations. Did all Reform rabbis approve of the treif that was served? No, they didn't. They didn't. There were even some Reform rabbis who said, we're going to remain Reform, but we're not so sure about this. So, and this would start a great deal of dialogue, a great deal of discussion. And that's where we get to the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. The Reform leaders, rabbis and Reform thinkers of the age said, we have to come up with something that really delineates what we stand for as Reform Jews. What does it mean to be a Reform Jew in the United States of America? We can't just sort of leave it to happenstance. We have to have something that really sort of states who we are. And so I sent you as a handout a copy of the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. I don't know if you read it or not. You can read it later if you haven't read it, but it's a clear outline of what Reform stood for. And you will see in certain things that are not binding any longer. If you look, like if you have it in front of you, number 4 says, we hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, there's kosher, priestly purity, and dress, there you're talking about kippah, talit, prayer shawl, etc., in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct rather than to further modern spiritual elevation. So the Reform movement was saying, we have to let this go. These are ideas that are from the past. They don't have relevance to our modern congregations. So we are going to let it go. We're not going to worry about the laws of kashrut. We are not going to command that people have to have head coverings when they come into the synagogue. We are not going to expect, at this time, men only to wear the talit, the prayer shawl. So they were willing to let much of what was considered at that time traditional Judaism fall by the wayside. They were, again, this attempt to really modernize Judaism. Now, did they go too far? Did they not go far enough? That's open to debate. That I can't answer that question. If you'd been alive in 1885, would these changes have been okay with you? Or would they have taken you just a step too far? Might you have been more comfortable in the new conservative movement, or even going back to orthodoxy? None of us were there, so we really don't know. But you can see how this Pittsburgh platform was really, really very revolutionary in stating these things are no longer relevant to us as modern Jews in the United States of America in the late 1800s.
Tim?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked 4, because speaking for myself as a Reformed Jew who has never really kept kosher, the language here seems awfully strong in terms of sort of the absoluteness of rejection of tradition, as opposed to saying something like, well, you don't have to do this, or well, it's optional. It just, the words entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. I would guess that would have been very controversial at that time, especially given that you mentioned that some of the Reform rabbis at the Trafe banquet felt that ignoring the dietary laws was a step too far.
It was, and some of them would then drift into the conservative movement. It was very strong language. It was so strong that there were Reform rabbis, and you've probably heard this, who then said, in my synagogue, you are not permitted to wear a kippah. You are not permitted to wear a talit. Not only are we saying, don't do it, some rabbis would go so far as to absolutely forbid it within their synagogues. So this really was a huge shift away from certain elements of Jewish tradition. And there were some, as I said, some who said, this is just too far, I can't do this. Strictly Reform, very Reform rabbis also did away with bar and bat mitzvah. There were no bar and bat mitzvahs. That's where confirmation started to come in, because confirmation was, again, something that more mimicked what was going on in the Christian congregations at an older age than bar and bat mitzvah. Bar and bat mitzvah 12, 13, confirmation more 16, 17 years old, toward the end of high school age people. And these were very radical reforms. I mean, it's reform. And it was too much for some people. And it was too much for some rabbis. Hence, we have this sort of middle ground now in conservative Judaism for those who said, yes, I want to see modernization, but I think we just have to temper it a little bit. So good point. Very good point. Yes, another question, Shelley?
Well, where does Orthodox come in all this? I mean, is that what the people who were already here were practicing, or how did that, I guess I'm not seeing how that developed here.
Well, those who were in traditional, now we would call Orthodox congregations, which had been were welcome to join UAHC, no longer now that it would become strictly Reform, continued to practice in their congregations with the very traditional old-fashioned services with all the trappings and, 3.5 hours on a Saturday morning, etc., separate seating for men and women. Those congregations continued as they always had. But now we are now seeing that you've got three options for your expression of Judaism. You can have the very, very reform. You can have the middle sort of reforming with a conservative congregation, or you can stick with the very traditional Orthodox congregation.
Did the traditional have like schools where they train their rabbis? I mean, was it as formalized?
Orthodoxy now has a number of seminaries, but at that point, most Orthodox rabbis were trained under the tutelage of a current Orthodox rabbi. It was more of a handing down kind of thing from one rabbi to someone who was young and interested and knowledgeable enough to then say, I would be willing to lead a congregation rather than a formal sort of university education.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so now we have this Pittsburgh platform, which really puts it out there. So Reform can't pretend anymore that they're not what this platform says they are. So we move into the late 1800s, the early 1900s. The CCAR, Central Conference of American Rabbis, CCAR, would be formed in 1889. That would be for rabbis. So the rabbis had their own little, club to kind of get together and talk and discuss, only Reform rabbis. So the CCAR was strictly for the Reform rabbis only. It still is in existence today, but it started in 1889. And the first official union prayer book, what we frequently call at Mikveh Israel, the UPB, the first union prayer book. Now we had Minhag America before, but the first union prayer book would come out in 1895. 1895 would be the first union prayer book. If you were to look at the very first edition of the union prayer book, the Hebrew is as minimal as it possibly can be. There is almost no Hebrew in the first union prayer book. It is almost an entirely English prayer book. It would be revised in 1918 and again in 1940 to be updated, but it clearly was an American English prayer book where 98% of what was being prayed and worshiped and chanted was in English. I mean, Hebrew had pretty much there was no movement among early Reform rabbis to have the congregants learn Hebrew. It wasn't considered essential. Hebrew was considered at that point a very dated language, and there were people who were saying that Hebrew was going to die. It was never going to exist. Well, of course, we know that's not true because it is now the language of Israel. It's been updated and made more modern. But at that time, people couldn't foresee that. They really sort of believed that Hebrew was going to fall by the wayside. There was going to come a point when nobody's going to speak Hebrew. So why should we bother to have our congregants learn Hebrew with a language that's going to die? Yes, Flossie, Jeff.
With this feeling, is that when it started with the Reform movement not being so Zionistic because they didn't see everyday Hebrew, they didn't see it for prayers, so
good point. You must be able to read my mind, because the next point I was going to make is that in 1898, just before the turn of the century, the Reform movement declared officially that it was anti-Zionist.
wow.
It officially declared an anti-Zionist belief. We don't believe that we don't believe in the founding of Israel. We don't believe that there needs to be an Israel. We don't believe that we need to go back to Israel. It was strongly, strongly anti-Zionist at the beginning, which surprises people that the Reform movement would be so anti-Zionist. But they again felt that that was deviating attention away from the people in the pews, the individual congregants. Let's not worry about what's going on over there and Hebrew and all of that. We need to worry about what's happening here in our synagogues, in our congregations, and let's get away from this whole notion of a Jewish homeland in Israel, which really surprises people that the Reform movement was strictly anti-Zionist, but it was declared as an anti-Zionist movement. So we're moving along. We have this modern Reform movement. We have the turn of the century. Reform continues to grow. It is a growing movement throughout the early part of the 1900s. Immigrants who are still coming into our shores now can choose to be Orthodox, conservative, Reform. The majority of people who were Western European Jews chose to come to the Reform movement. Many Eastern European Jews were more comfortable in either an Orthodox or a conservative congregation. But nonetheless, it was continuing to grow and was really the major expression still of Judaism in the United States. In 1922, a second institute to train rabbis was started. And it was started by Rabbi Stephen Wise, W-I-S-E, just like it sounds. Rabbi Stephen Wise started another school for the training of clergy. And it was called the Jewish Institute of Religion. And it was going to be another ground for a university education for rabbis to go into congregations. However, when Rabbi Wise started what we would call the JIR, the Jewish Institute of Religion, he was not quite as Reform as Hebrew Union College. Even though it was a Reform institution, he did try to keep a little more of the tradition in his college. So he was trying to kind of get a little bit away from the ultra Reform, even though he considered his institute of religion, to be a Reform college, a Reform institute for training rabbis. Another major issue of the early 1900s was the Reform movement would go global. We were focusing on the United States, but in 1926, the Reform movement would go global, beyond the United States. And that's when the World Union for Progressive Judaism started. The World Union for Progressive Judaism. In much of the world, rather than call it Reform, it is often called Progressive Judaism or Liberal Judaism. And so realizing that they wanted to have a way of getting the Reform ideas beyond the United States of America and beyond Canada, because the Reform movement had also gone into Canada. They started the World Union for Progressive Judaism in 1926. This was an organization that wanted to make Reform or progressive ideals in Judaism worldwide, and it still exists today. I get emails all the time from the World Union for Progressive Judaism, holding different kinds of events throughout the world that you can zoom in on nowadays. You don't have to be there in person. But it was a movement that, okay, if we think that Reform is the way that Judaism is going to go, it's the way of the future, then you know what? We need to have it worldwide. We can't just focus on the United States anymore. We need something that is going to be an outreach to the entire world, Jewish diaspora communities throughout the world. So you would have this now global outreach of Reform principles to other nations of the world. And it began to be successful in countries like Great Britain. It began to have some success in France, in Jewish communities in Western Europe. So this outreach to other Jews in other parts of the world with Reform ideals. Then we would get to 1937 and the Columbus. We had the Pittsburgh platform. Now we've got the Columbus platform. Why? Because they met in Columbus, Ohio. What an interesting idea. So in Columbus, Ohio, they would have a gathering of the greatest Reform rabbis and the greatest thinkers of Reform Judaism, just to see, okay, where are we headed with this? Where are we going with this Reform movement? Well, the Columbus platform was interesting for two reasons, two things that happened. All of a sudden, Reform Judaism was now going to become pro-Zionist. Yeah. Where they were anti-Zionist in 1898, now a mere almost 40 years later, in 1937, well, we think we need to become pro-Zionist. But what was going on in the world in the 30s?
Right.
the rise of Nazism, the
Nazism.
rise of Hitler, a great deal of anti-Semitic incidents occurring in Nazi Germany and beyond. So the idea of maybe, really would be a good idea for there to be a Jewish homeland, a place where Jews know that if they're not safe in the countries they are living in currently, that they could go and they could find some element of safety. So it was a complete flip from very anti-Zionist in 1898 to now a reform movement that was going to be very pro-Zionist and stand for the notion of a state of Israel. That was a huge change for the reform movement, a very, very big change for them. The second thing, so that was change number one in the Columbus platform. The second change that came out of the Columbus platform was, some of the traditional ideas might be okay. We threw them all out back in 1885 as saying they were dated, they had no significance, they had no relevance, they weren't making people feel more spiritual or more connected to their Jewish faith. Maybe we were a little too hasty on some of that. So the Columbus platform would have a statement. I couldn't find a copy of it anywhere to save my life, or I would have sent it to you, but it had language in it that said that traditions of Judaism needed to be re-examined. So they were open to re-examining all these traditions like kashrut and kippah and bar and bat mitzvah, et cetera, so many things that have been thrown aside, and even Hebrew as a liturgical language of prayer. All of those things that had been shunted aside in the Pittsburgh platform were now open for discussion again. They weren't necessarily going to bring them all back. They weren't saying that, but at least they were going to be open for discussion. So maybe we can bring some of these things back. So you can see now there is a shift. They went completely off one side, and now there's a little bit of a movement back to sort of a middle ground. And this was going to start to take root in the late 30s and into the 1940s. Of course, as I said, the 30s were a horrific time for the Jewish population in the world as the horrors of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust were revealed. It was going to be devastating to Jewish communities throughout the world when the millions upon millions of people who were murdered simply because they were Jewish. But interestingly enough, in the 1940s, the number of Reform congregations doubled. So you had a huge movement of congregations joining the Reform movement and supporting Hebrew Union College and asking for Reform trained rabbis. So somehow there was this wanting an organization and wanting to be part of the organization that came out of the 1940s, whether it was maybe as a reaction to the Holocaust, as in a need to feel some sense of being together and being united and standing together because we saw what happened in Europe. But the number of Reform congregations would grow significantly as to double. So we are talking about, it went from around 300 congregations to about 600 congregations in the matter of a few years, which is very significant. Some smaller congregations, some larger congregations, but nonetheless congregations who clearly stated, we want to be part of the UAHC. We want to be part of Reform Judaism. Because Reform Judaism was growing in this middle 20th century period so quickly, a couple of major things happened. They would open the School of Sacred Music in 1948. So in 1948, shortly after the close of the war and the revelation of all the horrors of the Holocaust, the School of Sacred Music was organized in 1948. This would be specifically to train cantors, to help rabbis in leading the service, to help rabbis in the training of teaching of the schools, associated with synagogues and Jewish Sunday schools, etc. So now there would be an official training. Prior to that, people who helped sing the service, lead the service through singing and chanting, did not have necessarily a formalized training. Now there would be a degree for those who really wanted to study for the cantorate and become cantors in Reform synagogues. Still not open to women yet, but that would come shortly. Initially, the School of Sacred Music would only train male cantors to serve in pulpits in Reform synagogues. Another major change in the late 40s, early 1950s would be the first Reform summer camps. Summer camps for the children to go and be immersed in Judaism while they are young in a sort of fun way with sports and swimming and activities and whatever. The very first summer camp was 1952. 1952 saw the very first Reform summer camp in, of all places, Wisconsin. Wisconsin. If you've been to Wisconsin, it's beautiful. There's lakes and there's rivers and it's gorgeous up there. You know that. You know, Maury and Shelley, you can tell us about how beautiful Wisconsin is.
And Amy. Well.
Yes. Oh, and Amy, that's right. You know, three of you know Wisconsin's gorgeous. So why not have a Reform Jewish summer camp in the beautiful lakes and woods and forests of Wisconsin? Of course, it would have been, that was the first, it would grow. And this would be a place where parents could send their kids for an immersion into Jewish ideals and ethics and principles, as they were also having a good time and having fun. Yes.
We'll open, Shelley's just learning about this, but we'll open our house to anyone this summer who wants to escape the Savannah heat and come to Portugal. So, but we do have,
we can have our own like adult Reform summer camp. Yeah. You know, that could be a lot of fun. You know, we could, you know, sing some great songs and make some great food and open some bottles of wine and it'll all be good. Yeah. All right, so in the 1950s, also Reform would face a major challenge, and this would be the civil rights movement. As we know, in the mid-50s and the late 50s and into the early 60s, the country was undergoing some significant social changes. One of those major social changes, of course, was the civil rights movement. And we know that Reform backs the idea of civil rights for all and human rights and equal rights for all. So why was this problematic for the Reform movement in the mid-50s? The majority of Reform rabbis, those who had training at the Reform institutions, were in support of the civil rights movement and in support of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and in support of whatever could be done to guarantee equal rights for African Americans. It wasn't the rabbis that were the problem. It was the congregations. I hate to tell you. There were many congregations who literally told their rabbis, don't you dare speak out about civil rights. Don't you dare think that you are going to march in civil rights marches with Dr. King or any other civil rights leaders. Why? It was fear. Plain and simple, it was fear. There was fear there would be an anti-Semitic backlash. That if Reform rabbis were seen out there marching in civil rights marches with civil rights leaders, the backlash of anti-Semitism against the Jewish community, against Jewish institutions, against synagogues, the congregations feared it. And so the boards of many synagogues told their rabbis, and remember, they have the power to hire and they have the power to fire, told them, you may have your personal ideas about civil rights, but you need to keep them quiet. Do not speak from the pulpit on it. Do not be writing letters to the editor of the local newspapers or op-eds in the local newspapers. You need to sort of keep it to yourself. Now, not every congregation. There were some congregations who said, yes, we need to be a part of this. We need to get out there. We need our voices heard. We need to stand in solidarity. We know that too. But this was a problem because you had some congregations who were foursquare in favor and some who said, let's just keep our heads down and keep quiet and let's not start anything of kind of anti-Semitic backlash. You know that in 1958, the temple in Atlanta, Atlanta's oldest Jewish congregation, one of the largest Reform congregation, was bombed in 1958 because their rabbi did speak out in favor of civil rights. The incident is memorialized in the movie and the play Driving Miss Daisy. If you'll recall, when she is going to services at synagogue and they have to turn around because they get news that the temple was bombed. And she's like, how could somebody bomb a temple? Who would want to do something like that? But it happened. And so Reform Judaism really had to tread a very fine line here. As the civil rights movement grew and became a movement that really was encompassing literally the entire nation in some way, more congregations began to relent and let their rabbis speak out. One of the most interesting things that happened with Reform rabbis was in 1961, 10 Reform rabbis were arrested, thrown in jail in St. Augustine, Florida, for being in a swimming pool with African Americans. So they went to, all 10 of them were thrown in a jail cell. And what was most fascinating is while they were in the jail cell, it happened to be Shabbat. And so they were chanting, Shabbat prayers, and they were singing in Hebrew. And the people who were running, the county jail in St. Augustine were like, what do we do with these people? They're praying. But, they weren't going to be stopped. This was important to them. And so ultimately Reform came down foursquare on the side of the civil rights movement, even though it was a bit of a dicey time when it first started in the 50s. So as we move, yes, question?
And not surprising in St. Augustine's, because at the time, the sheriff and the mayor of the town were the two leaders of the Ku Klux Klan in St. Augustine's. It was probably one of the top Klan towns in the country.
Well, there you go. It explains why then you have 10 Reform rabbis sitting in jail on a Shabbat. So yeah, it makes sense. So as the 60s move on, the RAC, the Religious Action Coalition, or Reform Religious Action Coalition, would get started in 1961. That was a way for Reform to stay on top of social issues where they felt that they needed to speak out and they needed to be a presence. They needed to have a voice. And it's still in existence today. Some other major things that would happen through the 60s and 70s, women would become finally a part of the rabbinate. We would allow the ordination of women into the Reform rabbinate. Sally Presand became the first ordained female rabbi in 1972. And from then on, we know that women have been studying for the rabbinate. And some of our most prominent Reform rabbis now are the very, very learned women. If you know Rabbi Angela Buchdahl at Central Synagogue in New York, who is an extremely, extremely brilliant Reform rabbi. So we have women coming into the cantorate as well. The women can study to be cantors in the School of Sacred Music as the 70s are dawning. So we are becoming truly a more egalitarian religious persuasion as we move ahead. I want to talk about Reform rocking the boat a bit in 1973. In 1973, Rabbi Alexander Schindler, who was the head of the Reform movement, Rabbi Alexander Schindler, in 1973 really began to rock the boat with three things that came out of Rabbi Schindler as goals for the Reform movement. And Reform movement would be rocking the boat with these three things. Number one, the first thing that rocked the boat was Rabbi Schindler said, as Reform Jews, we are now going to accept patrilineal descent. If your father was Jewish, we are going to recognize you as Jewish. This was a big shift. Again, maybe it doesn't sound that revolutionary to us today, but to recognize patrilineal descent, which in the early days of Judaism, they did do, by the way, way back. But it hadn't been done for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. He said, we are going to recognize, so if your father is Jewish, we are going to consider you Jewish. That was a big deal. Yes, that rocked the boat.
Yeah, biblical.
Pardon me?
It was biblical. I
Yes.
mean, that's the way it was originally.
Yes, people forget that in the early days of Judaism, going way back into the Torah, into Temple Judaism, yes, we did accept patrilineal descent way, way back. We got away from it, and Rabbi Schindler said, we're going back to it, and we're going to recognize it again. So good for Rabbi Schindler. Number two, we are going to allow intermarried, interfaith couples into full synagogue membership. Full synagogue membership. That had not been done. That you were going to permit intermarried, interfaith couples to have full synagogue membership, allowing the non-Jewish partner to be an equal member of the synagogue, allowing the non-Jewish partner to come up on the bima for a bar or a bat mitzvah. This, again, sounds maybe not so revolutionary to us today, but at the time, it was. Rabbi Schindler's thinking was, we really should not be turning people away. If we don't make it a welcome place for interfaith couples, you know what's going to happen? We're going to lose them entirely. We will lose them entirely. So this was a major step forward. And third, he said, we need to have outreach to those who are seeking conversion to Judaism. We need to welcome them. We're not going to proselytize, be careful. He wasn't saying to proselytize, but for those who were seeking a spiritual home and they saw what they were seeking in Judaism, he said, we need to nurture them, we need to welcome them, and we need to have programs in place to help them. And this was also a major shift. Prior to this, the thinking on most rabbis was, if somebody comes seeking conversion, turn them away, turn them away, turn them away. If they're really persistent, then maybe say yes. Well, now we have rabbis in the reform movement are saying, we're going to have programs to help you do this, and we're going to nurture you through it. And we're going to help you to, figure out whether Judaism really is the spiritual home for you. And if you decide that it is, we're going to welcome you with open arms, and you are going to become as Jewish as anybody else. And so this was a major step forward also that Rabbi Schindler was behind. So these three things, patrilineal descent, acceptance of interfaith couples into full synagogue membership, and nurturing those who were seeking a place in Judaism as a spiritual home, those were major, major shifts forward. It rocked the boat because none of the other movements of Judaism were ready to take these steps at that point. Some have come around since, but at that point, Reform was standing completely on its own as a Jewish movement. Okay, trying to move forward here because remember the rabbis I got 20 minutes told I got to turn this over to the rabbi for his program. So let me try to finish up here. 1975 would see a new prayer book in the Reform movement, and that was prayer book that maybe some of you know as Gates of Prayer. Gates of Prayer would become the official Reform prayer book in 1975. Two things that happened in Gates of Prayer, which is why I'm mentioning it. Gender neutral language. Gender neutral language in Gates of Prayer. The idea of we don't have to think of God necessarily as God as he. God does not necessarily need to have a gender, and God is genderless. So that was a big shift in the Gates of Prayer prayer book. The second thing that happened in Gates of Prayer, a lot more Hebrew was coming into the prayer book. And for those of you who may remember Gates of Prayer or maybe don't remember Gates of Prayer, go look at your copy if you have one of Gates of Prayer. There's no transliteration under the prayer. There is the Hebrew and there is the English. If you want transliteration, you have to flip to the back of the prayer book and find it. Why? The rabbis were now going to start encouraging congregants to learn at least prayer book Hebrew, learn to read prayer book Hebrew. And so they did not have transliteration directly under the prayer. Good point, bad point, we can argue that, but that was the thinking when they published Gates of Prayer. There were people who loved Gates of Prayer, and there are people to this day who think it's the worst thing that's ever been published. I'll leave that for you to decide. But if you haven't seen Gates of Prayer, it's worth looking at, because people forget that there was no transliteration of the Hebrew in Gates of Prayer. All right, moving on. We would also have in the 1970s the first official Torah commentary in the Reform movement, and that's the one we still use today, the Plaut. The Plaut Torah commentary was the first officially sanctioned Reform Torah commentary. It's been updated and revised since the mid-70s. Rabbi Gunther Plaut was the one who put it together. A very learned rabbi. I think the last congregation he served before he died, interestingly enough, was a relatively small congregation in Traverse City, Michigan, if I remember correctly. But he published the first officially sanctioned Reformed Torah commentary in the mid-70s, which was a major step forward. And a couple of other things. In 1996, I don't have this on your handout, the leader of the Reform movement was Rabbi Eric Yoffe. Rabbi Eric Yoffe was the leader of the Reform movement. And you want to talk about going back to tradition. Rabbi Yoffe made a speech in which, again, he sort of rocked the boat a bit. He said, these are the things we have to do as Reformed Jews. He said, number one, we must focus on Torah study. As Reformed Jews, we've been very, very lax on Torah study, and we need to get back to Torah study. And this is 1996, by the way, when he's saying this. Number two, we need to get back to observance of Shabbat. We need to make Shabbat a priority because we haven't been doing a good job of that as Reformed Jews. So we're going to study Torah more. We're going to make observance of Shabbat a central part of being a Reformed Jew. And we are going to make Jewish liturgy important again. People need to understand the liturgy. They need to understand what is happening during the service. It shouldn't just be rote, but there should be some understanding of the liturgy. And again, these are rather traditional ideas. So you can see how Reform threw all the tradition out, and now Reform is bringing tradition back in. And I'm going to end with these final 2 points, the Pittsburgh Platform of 1999, which I gave you the handout that's a little bit confusing, but it was the best I could do. The Pittsburgh Platform of 1999 came really close to dividing Reform Judaism. Why? The 1999 Pittsburgh Platform was foursquare in favor of tradition, in favor of the old traditions. Hebrew. Let's bring back people wearing kippah. Let's bring back wearing talit. Let's bring back and make sure that we have some Hebrew literacy in our congregations. And there were a number of rabbis who were not happy. At the end of the meeting, it passed, but just barely, just barely. They barely got 50% of the rabbis, Reform rabbis, to agree to it and to sign on to it. And I can remember, I was in Ohio at the time, and my congregation in Ohio, and I can remember our rabbi there, giving several sermons and discussion groups about the Pittsburgh Platform and who was in favor. And in the seats, those of us who were the congregants in the seats, disagreeing. There were those who said, no, this is not Reform Judaism. This is not who we are. We are not supposed to be sanctioning these traditions. This is what we started, and this is what we moved away from. And now you're saying to bring it all back. We're not Reformed Jews anymore, if that's what we're doing. And it still causes discussion today. And if we would take a poll, and it's why some people, the new prayer book, Mishkan Tefillah, which was adopted in 2007, to some Jews is the worst prayer book ever because it's so traditional. It's so traditional. It has a lot of alternate readings, but it goes back to tradition. And a lot of people don't like it. There are Reformed Jews who say, I want to go back to the 1885 Pittsburgh platform. And that version of Reform Judaism, that's what we call classical reform. And others say, no, 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 no. We need to bring some of it back. We just went too far. We need the traditions back. But Reform's theory now is that, no, you don't have to wear a kippah. No, you don't have to wear a tallit. No, you don't have to learn Hebrew. But you know what? You should have the options to do so if you want to.
So Tim, I have a
Yes.
question. So you're going to need to put your fortune teller cap on for this one. And this question comes from my background, having grown up Reform in Memphis in the era where no rabbi would ever wear a kippah. 3% perhaps of boys, 0% of girls were bar and bat mitzvah. But of course, a member of a conservative congregation here in Eau Claire for 26 years. I'm just curious, in 10 years, 20 years, will there be a distinct difference between Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism, or will the difference be lost, and will they kind of merge or get to the point that you walk in a synagogue and you can't tell if it's Reform or conservative?
Okay, you asked me to put my prediction hat on, like fortune teller hat on. I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from, and this is just my opinion. You are all free to disagree with me and say I am 100% dead wrong, and I'm okay with that. I'm good with that. I think you are going to see at some point a merger between Reform and conservative. I think there will be a merger between the two movements. It will strengthen the numbers in the United States of America. Conservative has adopted increasingly liberal stances on social issues, whereas Reform, many people in Reform want to bring back tradition. Do I see the merger as a good thing? In my own opinion, I think it would be stupendous. I think it's where we need to go. If you've ever, those of you who know me, I wouldn't set foot in a synagogue without tallit and kippah. I don't. I won't. I believe it sets, for me personally, it's just me, for me, it sets a mood. It sets a feeling of reverence, of prayer, of where I am and what I'm doing and what I'm about for the next hour, hour and a half. And so to me, it's important. Now, I'm not saying that works for everybody, and I don't want it to work for everybody. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But I think that's where we're headed, where it's not Reform, it's not conservative, it's Jewish. It's all Jewish. And do the things that matter to you and are meaningful to you. If keeping kosher matters to you and it's meaningful to you, then by all means do it. Whatever any of the traditions are. And if they don't mean anything to you, then don't. And we won't point the finger at you and say, bad, bad, bad. You do for you what matters and makes you feel comfortable, spiritual. That's where I see it going. And I do think down the road, we are going to see the lines between Reform and conservative blur. I also think the Reconstructionist will come into it as well. And I think we will have this sort of just overall, maybe we'll just call it modern Judaism. I don't know what the name will be, where we'll all be together. And, rabbis are rabbis and cantors are cantors, and the people in the seats are the people in the seats. And, it's all good. But again, you're free to disagree with me.
Well, I was going to ask where Reconstructionist comes in, but you sort of answered that.
Reconstructionist is very liberal. It's a very liberal movement. Its basic theology is that Judaism is not a people. It's a civilization that is constantly evolving. That's the Reconstructionist theory, a constantly evolving civilization, but not a real peoplehood. They kind of just dismiss the peoplehood aspect. But there again, that's something where if you believe in the peoplehood thing, fine. If you don't, you don't. Jews have always been able to disagree. You remember, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. That's how we like to argue. We like to discuss. That's part of the root of Judaism. It's what we do. And it's part of what's the beauty of Judaism is, really, because we can do this. And I can respect what you say and you can respect what I say. But the bottom line is we're all Jewish. And that's the good thing. Anybody else with any final thoughts, comments? Because I know I'm going to get under the rabbi's time here in 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes, Flossie.
You're saying that might truly be our hope for the future, because I read something today in an email that upset me very much. I don't know if you read it. That, who is it? The Pew study?
Yes, that studies religion in America, yes.
And they went and said they interviewed many people, and mainly the youth. And the youth said 1/3 of these people said, as far as, I'm sorry, only 1/3 cares if their grandchildren are Jewish. The 2/3 really don't care. And that upset me no end, that this is our youth and where they're going. So maybe what you're saying, instead of us going with labels, conservative, reform, this, merging it together, taking what we have in Judaism that's so beautiful,
Right.
and working on its strength. You have to do your part over in Europe to have it float across the ocean.
Oh, I will. I will. You know me, I'm dedicated.
I don't think we'll ever get together with the other half of
We didn't say
Judaism.
that. We didn't
Oh.
say.
Well, the Orthodox are still, and it's okay that they will have their way of worship as well. We will respect their thinking. We will respect their way to worship. We just sometimes we'll have to just agree to disagree on things. That's just the way it is. But we're all still, I want to get back to the idea that we're all Jewish in the end. And we want to see Judaism, survive and flourish and be a spirituality that, because there is so much in it that's beautiful for generations to come.
That's why you did such a great job with the conversion classes.
Thank you.
Bringing people in, I'm not just saying that, because we have people who are born and don't practice, don't feel what they should. And then when people choose to come in, you feel very good about it.
And I think it's important because there's so much beauty in Judaism. I really believe that. And I like to stress that there's so much that's really just, it's so wonderful as a way of thinking and spirituality that has a lot to offer people. And that's why I think we're seeing people attracted to it, because they see that when they read Jewish texts and they read about Judaism, they see the beauty in it. So, yes.
What is the rabbi going to be talking on tonight? Do we stay on?
No. He's got a whole separate meeting he's running. No, that's why I have to be done by 8 o'clock, because he's got a whole separate group that he's dealing with at 8 o'clock. It's not us. No. So anyway, I'm going to bid adieu because I've got like 5 minutes to turn this off so that the rabbi can turn it on. And thank you, everybody. I hope it was.
Thank you.
I hope I'll see some of you, all of you next week. But thank you. Have a great week, and early Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Good night. Good night.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.